Hey guys, it's Sasha. The United States is in a de facto recession. US consumers have run out of money and millions are now in financial trouble. And I want to show you the data that shows all of this happening because for some reason this data is not shown at all by the mass media. 3 weeks ago, a firm published a study saying 3 out of 5 Americans think the economy is in a recession. The survey of 2,000 Americans explored what's driving this lack of consumer confidence in the economy. Inflation and the rising cost of living, 68%, tops the list of reasons why respondents believe the US is in a recession, followed by friends and family members complaining about money, which is 50%. So the majority of Americans in this survey are saying that they are somewhat struggling to make ends meet, and half are saying that people close to them in their immediate family and friend circle are complaining to them about money, presumably complaining about, running out of money instead of having too much money and not knowing what to do with all of it. And 2 months ago, the St. Louis Federal Reserve added new data from Visa that shows consumer spending on Visa credit cards. Here is the overall chart. Consumer spending in July hit the lowest level since the start of this data set in 2014, if you exclude the March 2020 flash crash. What's even more interesting is that discretionary spend has plummeted even harder. Here you can see the discretionary line, and the index in July is down at 93.5. Again, much lower than at any point outside of that 2020 crash. So US consumers are pulling back from spending on non-essentials because they don't have the money. The data is accelerating and it's looking pretty bleak. This is the same story as when I talked about spending on new cars a week ago. Every single major car manufacturer is reporting bad sales data in the United States. Ford stock collapsed 33% recently after their quarterly report came out, and it's interesting because if you look at other credit card usage data, the picture becomes even more clear. Here is a report by the New York Fed on household credit that just came out. I hope the 5-year-old intern who makes these charts gets paid handsomely for their design efforts, but you can see that since inflation took off, the number of credit cards in the US has increased by approximately 20% to 600 million. Inflation was peaking in Q1 of 2022, and the transition to delinquency for credit cards has increased from 4.1% back then to 9.1% in the most recent quarter. The term transition into delinquency brackets 30 plus just means the number of people who missed their first payment. 30 plus means that you are now 1 month behind on your payments. So the number of people beginning to miss their first payment has more than doubled in the last 2 years, roughly equivalent to what happened at the start of the 2008 financial crisis. Although the regulations around credit cards have changed significantly in favor of customers since then, but the data doesn't stop there, it gets worse. You see, the problem with credit card debt is the snowball effect of going into delinquency. Once a customer misses a payment, 2 things happen. 1, the customer gets hit with a late payment fee, which is on average $32 in the US. So whatever the minimum payment was that the customer could not afford already, the bank goes and adds another $32 on top of that, and then the bank also charges you interest on top of the amount you owe and the fee, and that credit card interest gets added again, and at the moment it's the highest level it's been in the last 16 years because, interest rates have been going up. So then when a customer is 1 month behind on their payments, they then get another statement, the next statement that they have to pay. And now they owe 2 months worth of payments. The first month that they missed, the second month they owe the late payment fee and all the extra interest. So if they couldn't afford the first payment, they are somewhat unlikely to then be able to afford a payment for 3 times as much money. It's interesting that in March, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the US published a new rule which would have helped customers in this specific position. It limited credit card late payment fees to just $8. That would at least give customers a breathing room, a chance if they're in financial trouble. Instead of piling on all the fees, they could maybe have an opportunity to pay it. But of course, the banks and credit card companies didn't like this rule because banks in the US make $16 billion a year from charging late payment fees. About 15 years ago, the US passed the Card Act, which means that credit card companies were restricted in how much money they could make from jacking interest rates, from interest rates up front. There's a whole bunch of stuff, not very interesting, but the average late payment fee has been going up and up and up since then because card companies realize, well, we can't earn money here, so we're going to go and earn money over here by screwing customers when they're in trouble and can't afford their payment. That helpful credit card company can just go and whack the customer with a huge fee that makes the payment even less affordable. Now, this wasn't a big issue while times were good because the relative number of people who couldn't afford payments wasn't as high. People could swallow the fees, but now that people don't have money, it's now blowing up into a very predictable, huge problem. Here's a chart for customers rolling into serious delinquency. You can see it says 90 plus at the top, so that means this is for customers going 3 months behind on their payments. And the blue line for credit cards has gone from 3.0% to 7.2% since the start of 2022. That's a 240% increase in the number of people going 3 payments behind. This is nuts, because once you miss one payment, the fees and interest and all that mumbo jumbo begins rolling up, and it becomes much, much harder to bring your account back up to date. And here is a St. Louis Fed's chart on US credit card charge-offs. This is what happens when the customers don't pay for over 6 months, and then the balance eventually gets written off by the bank. The customers get into a massive heap of financial trouble. Well, you can see that the charge-off rate has increased by 3 times since Q4 2021 to 4.65%, and that's the highest level since the financial crash, and roughly the same level of acceleration at the moment as at the start of the financial crash and the start of the dot-com crash. In the last few weeks, companies in the non-discretionary spending category have been reporting bad results. Disney just reported that their theme park's operating profit fell 3% in the last year. A few days ago, Airbnb reported that they are seeing signs of slowing demand from US guests. Stock is down 24%. Hilton and Marriott are saying that consumer spending is slowing in the US. McDonald's is saying the same exact thing. KFC and Taco Bell are saying the same exact thing. Tesla's US sales are down despite cutting prices. Airlines are seeing weak demand in the United States. The US savings rate dropped at the peak of inflation, but inflation in the US is now gone, but the savings rate is dropping again and is now down at 3.4%, significantly lower than at any point since the end of the financial crash. People are not saving money because they don't have any money to save. They're struggling to make ends meet. Almost 2 weeks ago, the Fed refused to reduce interest rates because they wanted to see more data. Almost all of this data I am showing you today was available 2 weeks ago. Consumer demand in the US has slumped and people have run out of money. 9% of people in the United States right now are missing payments on their credit cards. In fact, it's worse than that. It's 9% of the balances, but people in worse financial positions typically have lower credit limits, lower balances. The proportions are just getting out of whack. This is a wild statistic. The charge-off rate on credit cards is increasing very fast and is now at almost 5%. That's 1 in 20. And the problem is that the increase in charge-offs is much higher than the increases in numbers of people missing their first payment. So the flow from people missing their first payment to charging off is high. And the reason for this is that people are in deep financial shit. The data shows that once you miss one payment, you are very likely, much more likely to keep missing payments all the way until you're screwed. And a week ago, we saw a sudden increase in unemployment data that sent the markets into a panic. All of this is, of course, a huge surprise. Absolutely nobody could have seen this coming. Impossible to predict. And the truth is, this is exactly what drives inflation down. Spending does need to reduce for inflation to go away. And jobs do need to get harder. Unemployment has to increase and people do need to have less money to spend. That is how inflation gets cured. That is the whole point of increasing interest rates. That is what the Fed increases rates to achieve. So a lot of people will point to this and say, well, hey, Sasha, the Fed is just doing its job and reducing inflation. They're doing really well. And you know what? Technically, it is kind of true. But here is how the Fed is doing its job. When inflation first started going up in 2021, it was a bit like you sitting in a restaurant and someone at your table is really, really thirsty. So you call the waiter and you ask for some water. The person who is thirsty has been hiking all day in high heat in the desert, so they need water urgently. They've not had a drop to drink. The waiter disappears and comes back 3 hours later with a tiny little glass of water. By this point, the person who needed water, call him Dave, is unresponsive, falling into a coma. And the tiny bit of water prevents them from dying. So technically, the waiter helped, with bringing the water. a bit too late. But you know what would have helped a lot more? Bringing the fucking water glass 1 minute after being asked and bringing a big glass. Like, you know, when inflation jumped to 4% in April 2021, the Fed could have gone and increased interest rates from 0 instead of waiting an entire year before inflation eventually hit all the way to 9%. And now, the Fed is doing the exact opposite. The person who was thirsty eventually did feel better. They got better, they were well hydrated, but then the Fed kept bringing out these huge jugs of water and pouring them down the poor person's throat and holding their mouth open, just pouring water in there. You know, you're thirsty, you need more water. Random guys on YouTube would be pointing out that this is not really helping anymore. In fact, it's kind of like torture now, and the person's on the verge of dying again from a different cause. The Fed says, shut up, we're waiting to see evidence that Dave is no longer thirsty. That evidence is a doctor's report that we filed. We're waiting 3 weeks to achieve it. Dave is lying there, poor guy, blue in the face, spasming, hands flailing, but the Fed is sitting there waiting for that report that takes another 2 weeks to arrive that would confirm that Dave is actually no longer thirsty before they stop pouring the water into Dave's mouth. So technically the Fed did help with, quenching thirst in the first place. That bit is accurate. And the Fed will eventually stop applying the water because, the doctor's report will turn up. But the point of the analogy is to show that the Fed could have perhaps done it another way. There is in fact more than one way, more than one approach to beat inflation, not all of them causing tens of millions of people to be in deep financial shit as a result of those actions of the Fed. Not all of them potentially leading to significant economic damage, which could have been avoided, potentially leading to deflation. In 2 days' time, we'll see the data for July inflation in the US, and in 1 month's time, we're going to get the August data. That's the really important one. These two data reads might be the two most critical inflation reads we've had in a very long time. Oil price has been hovering at around $80 a barrel for some time now, so that shouldn't be a major factor in inflation data coming up. Natural gas is sitting substantially lower than this time last year, and energy prices have still not caught up with the drops that happened last year in the first place, so energy should not be pushing inflation up. And all the data is pointing to car sales being very slow, so that won't be pushing inflation up either. Other non-discretionary spending is down significantly. We already know that from data. Mortgage rates in the US have started falling in anticipation of rate cuts. 30-year deals are down 0.5% to 6.55%. Trueflation is reporting that food inflation is now at almost 0%. And I know a lot of people won't feel this way. A lot of people say, Sash, you don't know shit, food is still really expensive, because prices have gone up so much, so fast, that even though they've now stopped going up even further, it just doesn't feel that way. I get it, but the data is the data. The real rate of inflation is already significantly below the Fed's 2% mark if you exclude the lagging shelter indicator, because that lagging indicator is still catching up with the rent increases that happened in 2021 and 2022. By the time the September FOMC meeting comes at the end of September, inflation could already be sitting at 2% before they start cutting rates for the first time. We won't know this, of course, because September's inflation data will only come out 2 weeks later in October, after that meeting happens, but we'll have all the data pointing to it. And then the Fed will put on their superhero cape and, reduce interest rates by 0.25%, from 5.5 to 5.25%, or maybe even 0.5% drop. But the problem is that it might be too late. It's like a driver who sees standing traffic right ahead and decides to start braking when they are 5 meters from the rear bumper of the car in front. It's good to start braking before you crash, sure, okay, yeah, but you could maybe use your brain a bit earlier, because you could see the fucking cars right there in front of you, and you could have started braking before you slam into the back of it. But because you're Jerome Powell and you're driving while staring in the rearview mirror, you never saw the cars that everyone else could easily see, and you are going to plow right into them anyway because you're an idiot. I really look forward to hearing all the usual excuses from the Fed, from the media that get paid to print them, with statements like, this happened faster than we expected. Nobody could have seen it coming.